A lot of people, when they put time into learning a language, they want to be able to speak it correctly. They have learned all these words, they've learned these grammar patterns, and they don't want to sound like an idiot and say things incorrectly. That's really common. But I would say the most important thing in learning a language fluently is that you need to be willing and able to say things incorrectly, to make a lot of mistakes. When I studied Chinese in class, I feel like the people who were the best at the end of the program learning the language were the people who made the most mistakes early on. Because being willing to have less of an ego and to know that you're saying things incorrectly but still trying is how you work on fixing mistakes and getting to a higher level. People who make a lot of mistakes, they're trying to say things that kind of pass the threshold of what they're comfortable with saying, pass what they would normally say. So instead of saying a very simple grammar construction, instead of using the most basic words, they're trying to experiment with more difficult wording, with more difficult grammar patterns, and they're probably going to make mistakes the first time they use it. But if you're talking to a good teacher or you're talking to a native speaker, they'll be able to correct you and they'll tell you, hey, yeah, I know what you mean, but you said it kind of incorrectly. Here is how you adjust it. So then once you've been corrected enough times, you'll start to remember those mistakes you made and you'll adjust. And then you'll be using the more complex grammar patterns, the more complex wording correctly. The people who try to stay comfortable and try to keep saying things in the most basic way possible, all of those people, yeah, they'll say like, hello, nice to meet you. They'll say that perfectly. They'll say, I like this perfectly, but they're not going to be saying any complex thoughts. They can say those super basic things without error, but they're never graduating on to that next level where you really start to be able to have more intricate conversations and to sound a lot more fluent. So I would say that that's a big thing you need to be able to do, is let down your ego and just be able to make mistakes and over time adjust those mistakes until you are able to say things a lot more fluently and at a higher level. That's a big thing with speaking. It would also apply to writing, any type of output at all. Try your best. And I would say if you know this thing I'm about to say, it's probably incorrect. If you know that, then you're on the right path, because that means you're really experimenting. If you're saying rehearsed lines, that means you're never going to improve. You're just going to keep saying the same things correct over and over that are too simple. You'll learn the language a lot slower. When you're doing your exposure to the language, when you're maybe sentence mining or trying to use comprehensible input and you're learning these more complex words, try to add those. The things you encounter in the language, try to use those words in daily life. And maybe you're not exactly sure what it means, but you think you know what it means, and go ahead and try to use that. I can't count how many times when I was talking to a native speaker or talking to a teacher, the amount of times I said something where they just looked at me like, what are you talking about? Completely confused. And then I would try to use circumlocution to try to say it in a different pattern, and then they would say, oh, that's what you were trying to say. No, actually, it's pronounced this way, or actually you only use that word in this certain circumstance. So being able to iron out those misunderstandings and iron out those more complex things is important. You might be asking yourself, if you don't have a teacher or if you don't have a native speaker to speak with you about how these more complex constructions are supposed to be used, you might be wondering that, because a lot of what I just said is all based on if you have a native speaker, have a tutor, teacher who's able to help you. If you're completely on your own and you don't have anyone like that, my first avenue would be to suggest maybe you could try to use some type of AI to help you. I know that kind of has its limitations, but that's a little better than nothing. And if you don't want to use AI because it might give you kind of incorrect information, it might actually lead you astray because it's not perfect by any means. If you're completely on your own, I would just recommend you try to use these patterns anyways, and you might develop some habits of using these words incorrectly. But when you eventually do talk to a native speaker, when you eventually do talk to a teacher, you'll be able to say those and then it will get called out. So I would say be willing to make mistakes no matter what, and over time you will adjust and you will start to use those things in a more appropriate manner and make those errors a lot less. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. If you're making mistakes, especially early on, it means you're on the right track.